today we're going to be looking at three different inventors that changed history, and really it's more the invention that changed history than the inventor himself. Because I talk with my students a lot about this, that if that person hadn't done that thing, that invention, would somebody else come along and done it as well? Probably. At the same time, in the same way, probably not. But these three inventions really have had a huge impact on society and really changed history. And so I'm sure you could guess, if you're thinking, you can write down what you think I'm going to talk about, and I'm sure they're there. There's a lot of them, but these are all American inventors, because this is who's who in American history. And so some of the other really important inventions I won't be talking about. But I'm going to start with Alexander Graham Bell. He lived from March of 1847 to August of 1922. He was born in Scotland, but his mother and father brought his family here, first to Canada and then to Boston. His mother was almost deaf, and so that might kind of give us a hint on what some of his drive came from. And his father was a teacher of deaf students, and so he had it in his blood. He moved to Boston to teach deaf mutes, and also at other schools, in particular the Clark School for the Deaf. And while he was there, he met Mabel Hubbard, who was a student. And she had become deaf after a bout with scarlet fever, and they ended up getting married, even though he was 10 years older than she. That whole student-teacher thing might have been controversial, or it certainly would be today, but maybe not then. And so it was through his studies of trying to get sound to deaf people using the telegram that led him to invent that lovely invention that you recognize. You probably have one just like that in your pocket, right? Mm-hmm. That's the telephone. Mm-hmm. So, that was all the background. Here's a picture of him and his wife, and then the young boy as what he was like as a child, about the time that his parents immigrated to Canada and then down into America. And so the telegraph was the new technology at the time. And across the United States, they were stringing wire along with the train tracks, since that area was already cleared. And they were communicating through the wires with a series of clicks. And he thought that he could use that same single wire to send two messages at the same time. Again, really on the forefront. And us, we're using phones and things that don't use wires at all. So that may not seem like a lot to us, but at the time, that was cutting edge. When Bell got involved in this whole communication across wires things, he wanted to send a voice message across the wire. And in 1876, he was awarded a patent for a method of transmitting sounds. He first sent sound over a phone in 1876 of March, when he summoned his laboratory assistants. And so the words on the very first telephone call was, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." And so now we just do that in a text message. No one wastes a phone call for that. And so it introduced the Bell Telephone Company, July 1877, and that commercialized Bell's telephone. And the first telephone was connected to a switchboard late 1877 and into 1878. And the first telephone exchange was in operation. And 3 years later, 49,000 telephones were in use. That's a pretty big jump. By 1900, there were nearly 600,000 phones in his system. And that number shot up to 2 million by 1905, 5.8 million by 1910. So America's wanted their telephones. Now, I should have looked up to see how many telephones are in America now. I didn't do that. Should have. Because households used to have a telephone if they were lucky. Now everyone has their own phone, and there's probably a center house phone as well. Alexander Graham Bell died August 2nd. On the day of his burial, telephone service in the United States was stopped for 1 full minute in his honor. I don't know if that would happen today. Too many people rely on their phones. All right, so that's Alexander Graham Bell. And at the end of our presentation, we'll go into a question and answer where we're kind of thinking about some of this stuff. Elias, how, show of hands, how many of you, when you were thinking who would be on this one, thought of this guy? I always like to throw someone new that I think maybe you are not familiar with.
Never heard of it.
Awesome, good. That way if I get something wrong, you won't know it. Okay, that was a joke. All right, so he was born in 1819, died in 1867, and he had always been interested in machines. He worked in the Lowell cotton mills, and if you're not familiar with the Lowell cotton mills, it's where all the fiber went and was spun into thread so that it could then be woven into fabric. This process of spinning fiber into thread was an amazing change in the way fabric was made. Instead of on a loom that's done by hand, it's all done by machine now. And Howe worked in one of these cotton mills, and because he was fascinated by machines, and he learned a lot about these machines and what they could do. So just before we go on to what he did, because I want to go back a little bit further in time. Before what he did, if somebody they're invited to a wedding and they're going to go to a wedding, they need a new outfit, they would go to a tailor. There were no department stores where you could buy a dress or a suit. You went to a tailor, and you would pick out the fabric, you'd pick out the buttons and the accessories, and he would take your measurements, and you'd talk about the style, and you'd come back later and pick up your outfit. And it would be the same for man or woman. Tailors were mostly men. It was a man's job, mostly. And it was a one-of-a-kind item, and rather expensive. Yes?
I was just wondering, were the tailors mostly male?
Yes.
And then women would do women's clothes?
No.
No.
No. No, he might have an assistant that works with him to help, like, with the measurements and stuff, but the men were the tailors. It was a skilled job, and women didn't have skills. Remember, we're talking early 1800s and earlier, right? Before clothes, before the sewing machine. So in the late 1800s, that's going to change. So I want you to understand how difficult it was. So women didn't have a closet full of clothes because it's expensive. And women that couldn't afford a tailor would be hand sewing at home, sewing their own. They'd buy some fabric and then sew their own garments for themselves and their children. And the same, a man would go and order a suit, and he might have one good suit and one work suit. So it was very laborious to get clothes sewn. So women did sewing in the home, but not in the tailor's shop. Okay, and so there was piecework. I'm going to have to back up on that. There was some piecework so that somebody who wanted to make shirts could have them all cut out and send them to women in the home that would sew them together, and they get paid by the piece, which was hardly anything. But for women that needed to make money, that was one option that they had, because they could stay home and take care of the kids in the house as well. So, but most of the thing was done by a tailor. Okay, so how, looking at these machines, decided that he needed to come up with a method of sewing using a machine. And so he worked for 5 years trying to develop a sewing machine, and he finally received a patent in 1846 for the first sewing machine. It doesn't look anything like what we use today. It didn't get very much attention. And so he sold the patent to England, and he moved there to improve on his machine, and he worked there for years. When he returned, he found that the machine that he had developed here had been widely manufactured. The interest had grown on it, and he didn't get any of the royalties. And finally, he did get his rights for his sewing machine reestablished in 1854. And so this changed, obviously, the garment industry drastically. For one, sewing became a woman's work. And so when they started manufacturing clothing with sewing machines that don't look quite like this is a very early model, and this would be late 1800s when they're starting to manufacture clothing, because it didn't happen overnight, it became women's work. And therefore it was paid very little because, well, they were women, and women don't need to earn money. At least that was the thought during the day, because they had a husband to support them, and that it was just something she wanted to do for fun. And of course that wasn't the case, because a lot of women were husbandless. Husband had passed or left her, and so she was oftentimes trying to support her children on her own in the meager wages that they paid women at the time. So maybe another day we'll talk a little bit about the garment industry in the late 18 to early 1900s, because that's a fascinating era. But I want to move on to the last invention.
Can I just add?
Oh, sure.
Go ahead. What was the method of turning that wheel? They didn't have a treadle. Well, they did it with her.
Yep.
Just a hand.
Cranked.
Because when I learned, we used
The treadle.
the
Yes.
treadle.
A trundle machine, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. What was your question?
The cotton mill was producing the fabric, but not any clothing.
Correct. It's literally, you can see threads here. What they're really doing in these first mills is making the thread, and then they send that to another factory that weaves that into a fabric.
Yeah.
So it's a two-step process, and both of them were using either early water to run their machines, hooked up to a river that kept the belts moving, and then later on they started using steam. There was steam, the spinning jennies is what they're called, that spins the thread, and so you don't have to do it on one of those wheels or a drop spindle. And then the big weavers, massive weaving machines, started using steam power as well.
And were women employed in those factories?
Women were employed in these factories, and these were not middle class or upper class women. They were the working class, and barely making enough to make ends meet.
So prior to this time, everything was done hand sewing? I mean,
Yes.
just
Yes.
without the machine?
Needle and thread.
Okay.
Yeah, so you could buy the fabric because of the machines. These machines started in the 1600s, this machine.
Okay.
And so, so the textiles were coming, so you could buy the fabric and you take it home if you were making your own clothing. You cut it out and hand sew it.
Hand stitch it?
Hand stitch it. Yeah, like the old quilts. If you ever see an antique quilt, it's probably all hand stitched. So, no sewing machines. So,
Labor.
yeah, very much so.
Labor.
Labor of love too, because you got to keep your family clothed.
Yes.
All right. Well, the Wright brothers. I'm sure when you were guessing who I was going to cover, the Wright brothers were on your list. So these, I'll call them the brothers, but it's just so you know, they do have names. It's Wilbur and Orville. They were sons of an ordained minister. Their family moved a lot due to his father's job, moving around for more preaching jobs. And the brothers were independent thinkers, and the father taught them to have a deep confidence in their own talents and an unshakable faith in of their judgment. And this is a quote from the father, a quote from what the brothers said about the father. So, an unshakable faith in the soundness of their judgment and determination to persevere in the face of disappointment and adversity. And that really describes some of the trials that they went through to get something off the ground. Adversity.
But could do what they did.
Right. And so they were educated in public schools. And Orville says there was always much encouragement to children to pursue intellectual interest, to investigate whatever aroused their curiosity. And so they were raised being curious and thinking, I can do it. So to summarize, they didn't go to college, neither one of them, or even marry. Even though they had this encouragement and education and intellect, they didn't go to college. They opened up, the two of them together, a print shop, and published a newspaper, and they designed their own printer to do so, and it was actually superior printing because of their design. And then in 1896, they opened up a bike shop, sales and repair. And some of the things they discovered in the bike shop, they ended up using in their airplanes. They developed their own self-oiling bicycle. The wheel hub was self-oiling, and some other light machine tools in the shop. So this bike adventure really was kind of the foundation for later years when they went into studying flight. So the Wright brothers realized that a successful airplane would require three things: wings to generate lift, a propulsion system to move it through the air, and a system to control the craft in the flight. Those are the three things that they were going to have to work on. The first experiment with a system they called wing warping was made a small biplane kite that was flown in the summer of 1899. Now these are not manned flights, these are a kite, that's why they call it a kite flight. They moved to a place called Kitty Hawk because it had the climate and the geography that was perfect for their experiments. It was an isolated village in North Carolina. It had high winds, tall dunes from which to glide, and a soft for landing because they're going to land hard. So they wanted something not rocky. And so they moved to South Carolina to do that. Excuse me, North Carolina. And they created the first glider in 1900 that didn't have propulsion. It just could glide, but that's something. It developed less lift than expected, and no one was on board, so there was no injuries. In the winter of 1901, they tested between 100 and 200 wing designs in a wind tunnel. So they developed a wind tunnel instead of all this counting on and testing things. And in 1902, for the first time, they shared flying duties, completing 700 to 1,000 flights, covering distances of up to 622 feet. And the remaining in the air for as long as 26 seconds. Well, that's not much, but it's a start. It's a start.
Look how far we've come.
Exactly.
Wow.
So in 1903, they spent the next 7 weeks assembling, testing, and repairing their powered machine and conducting flight tests with a glider. In 2003, Orville made the first successful flight covering 120 feet and was in the air for 12 seconds. Wilbur flew 175 feet in 12 seconds. He covered more space in the same amount of time. And then Orville 200 feet in 15 seconds. So they're getting there. They're really getting there. And so they built 2 more aircrafts in 1904 and 1905, and moved to a pasture near Dayton, Ohio, another place they thought would be good for their designs. They continued to improve on their design and gaining skill and confidence in the air. One of the things they needed to worry about was the rudder. And so they had to design a way that while they were in the air, they could adjust that. By October of 1905, they could stay in the air for almost 40 minutes. So big difference. Wilbur went on to Europe to develop airplanes more there. And Orville began Army flight trials at Fort Myer, Virginia. and he had a horrible accident where the accident killed his passenger. He was hurt badly. So Wilbur came home, and together they worked in Fort Myer and continued on with trials. They exceeded the required speed limit of over 40 miles an hour, and they earned a bonus of $5,000 because they met their goal. And the original contract was $25,000. Again, probably doesn't sound like much now, but in 1900 it probably was. And so in only 70 years, and as you mentioned, Corinne, we went from, wow, we flew 200 feet to putting a man on the moon, literally in 70 years.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
so absolutely incredible changes. And so I have a few questions that I thought would be fun to just discuss real quick.